Hello and welcome everyone. I'm the chair of the panel. I'm really happy to introduce the topic and also introduce the panelists here with me. And it seems like it's going to be a very interesting discussion. We just had a nice intro in the preparation room for the panel for the webinar, and I feel like this is going to be quite interesting and quite involved. So I'm looking forward to it. So. The panel is AI and startups, challenges and opportunities, and there's many of those. Many opportunities and many challenges, of course. We're talking about the use and integration of AI into a startup's product development exercise or service development exercise, i.e. how to use AI within the organization to actually deliver more efficient services or innovative products. Or how can you develop new products leveraging AI or new offerings leveraging AI? So it's going to be basically on both. And we have, which hopefully is going to be quite an interesting discussion, how would startups adopt either policies, strategies, tools, and of course, always taking into account ethics in terms of making sure that they have the right capabilities and the right offering into the market. And at the end, how can you be successful? How can you address the business needs and the business issues and deliver something that that businesses would want, and therefore you can be successful from a business and financial startups. At the end of the day, as a business, you need to make sure you deliver the right outcomes. And so without further ado, I'll just do a quick background on myself and then ask the other panelists to introduce themselves and then kick off. So my name is Ghazi Atallah. I'm the founder and CEO of Picasa AI. Before going into Picasa, my background is really quite simple. I have a software engineering background, quite geeky in the initial stages of my professional life. I was developing software for the telecom industry and so on, and product development. So quite a technical background, and then moved into big tech and took on leadership roles at Cisco. At the end of the Cisco career, a 10-year, 11-year career where I was leading actually a telecom market segment for Cisco across emerging markets with a multi-billion-dollar organization and also staff. It was quite interesting. It was one of the biggest universities of life that I've experienced. I mean, the big tech certainly teaches you how to manage a business and manage your business quite effectively. Then I decided to go back to my passion, which was entrepreneurship and technology, and launched Picasa. And Picasa is about using technology to affect our living space. So how to use technology to make buildings, spaces, roads, intersections, cities, districts more sustainable, more secure, and also how do you do so in an efficient way using the latest and greatest in terms of technology. That's a little bit of a background on me and Picasa. I'm gonna now ask Sara. Please, can you start and introduce yourself and a bit of background?
Yeah, and that was lovely background. I think it's really nice to be with this group today, and this feels like a very interesting conversation. So I'm excited to chat and to also hear questions from people who are listening in. So I lead a research team that works on frontier AI models. So right now I lead our research team at Cohere for AI. So we work on large models at scale. So language models, multimodal. Previous to this, I was at Google DeepMind. So I do a lot of work on efficiency. How do we make these models more accessible? But also, how do we make these models robust in the world? So I think it's really interesting to think about, for example, multilingual. How do models serve various different geographies and users all over the world? I'm a computer scientist, so a lot of my work is leading a technical team that builds these models. But I also, I think it's a rare moment over the last 3 years where frontier ideas and like this technology has immediate impact. So I think increasingly I also find myself in conversations like this where we're also thinking about how do we make sure that this technology has an impact in a meaningful way that actually serves people all over the world. So maybe I'll pass on. So Ghazi, did you have an order in mind? Or I can tag maybe Rupa, you can go next.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, Rupa, I think you're muted. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Such a pleasure being here and able to share the platform with the esteemed speaker and to be with World Salon. So to introduce myself, I'm Rupa Singh, founder and CEO of the AI Bode and AI Beehive. And I've been recognized as top 20 global AI ethics leader. And shared more than 100 keynote speakers globally and created a lot of awareness sessions within India and created awareness and education on AI, data science, machine learning, and ethics of AI. And also I approach AI ethics from a Buddhist perspective. and and I've also, as a prominent voice in the AI field, an advisory board of the FAIR Festival of AI and Robotics and Dakla International Education Forum. And my mission is to empower more than 1 million individuals to build AI for human dignity. And I've delivered over 20,000 hours of training to more than 3,000 students in AI ethics, data science, and machine learning. And I've also been featured on international TV in the US and received Entrepreneur of the Year for Innovation in Business 2021 by the Progress Global Foundation, and a master in AI and machine learning. So yes, and pleasure to be here.
Wow, nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mark?
Hey, pleasure to meet everyone. My name is Mark Daniel. Folks call me MD for short. I've been in the kind of high-tech space, investing space now for the last 5 years. My particular role at AWS is as a member of the venture capital business development team. And so my team manages the relationship between AWS and many of the top VC firms, really effectively the top VC firms in the world. And we work with the top startups in the world in a variety of capacities across, different forms of investment, strategic partnerships. My team allocates millions and millions and millions of dollars of credits as well a year, amongst a variety of other capacities. So was at Google, started my career at Google for 2 years as a philosophy major in undergrad, with a strong interest in the ways in which technology would continue to kind of shape our society more broadly. Led me to Google, was there for 2 years across Google Pay and the search ads team, and was an investor as in a fund of funds capacity and as a direct investor. Worked on kind of several of the larger funds. Think about if we look back now, if I think about Andreessen's original crypto fund, a $1 billion vehicle, amongst some of the other kind of major funds that were coming out back in 2020 when the VC industry started to really shift into really a different animal altogether. And then now I've been at AWS for just over 2 years, really working with some of the best founders in the world, spending a lot of time. I spun up a Substack that has since it hasn't fully retired, but it's certainly been it's been, I haven't published much lately, but really focused on technology, looking at issues around total factor productivity and AI's capacity to impact total factor productivity, and then obviously looking at kind of different organizations within AI and their different missions. I spent a lot of time, I was telling Ghazi this earlier, I spent a lot of time really just poring over what is the latest coming out from a research perspective. Thankfully, a lot of folks have automated the research paper proliferation process, and so Substack is extraordinarily useful. But either way, excited to be joining all of you on this conversation.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Appreciate
I'll
it.
quickly caveat, much of the knowledge I would share today is widely and publicly available and relative to what we may hear from Sara. So
Okay, well, wonderful. Let's start with Sara. Sara, maybe, the first question to you, and then we'll go through some questions just to kick off, get the conversation going. And the first question to you is of course, about the area that you are very much focused on. So what are some practical steps startups can take to ensure their AI models are free from bias during development and deployment? And what are the emerging techniques? But let's start with the first one.
Yeah, maybe why don't we take a wider view just to, keep this question more fun, because I think there's both bias, which is one aspect of what's undesirable about model behavior, but there's also just that it's part of a wider question that people typically have, which is how to evaluate these models in general. So the reason I say it's interesting to take this wider lens is that bias is typically also going to be very specific to your industry, the same way evaluations are. So what I mean by that is that we work a lot with multilingual. We released Aya this year, which is the most performant multilingual model that is open weights. Multilingual is a perfect example of this. So typically, if a company or researchers are deploying models in multiple languages, they need to have safety checks in multiple languages. So this is one of the first critical kind of cliffs in the availability of benchmarks. So I would say the following, like here are my recommendations. So you will have a sense of what matters to you, either as a business or where you're, working with a user base. And typically, even though a lot of what we think of is really powerful about these models is a moving from specialized to universal models, when it comes down to it, when you talk to people about what they care about, they typically have in mind maybe 3 use cases that are very important that they want the model to do very well at. And I would say this is where you need to define your evaluation set. And I would also suggest people invest in private evaluation sets that they've themselves curated, mainly because we have a lot of test set leakage right now. So basically, because these models, one of the most powerful things about these models is that they've trained on enormous amounts of data. But it also means that if something has been on GitHub or using an evaluation set that everyone uses, it may have already been kind of I don't know, somehow sucked into training. So this is important. So I would say, firstly, know what your use cases are. What do you actually care about? So most people say they care about MMLU or some very famous benchmark, but that might have nothing to do with performance on what your task is. For example, some people in reality, when they're using these models, they need to consistently output a certain length. This is a very boring example, but it's super true for many businesses. They need a certain length of what they output and they need consistency. So your evaluation should reflect that. You should have your set of prompts on whatever you care about. And then for bias, I would say the following. So one is have evaluations that you care about. The second is don't treat it as if it is a sign off just before you deploy. You need to probably be evaluating throughout the process. By that, I mean, if you know that you, for example, want to have safety benchmarks in multiple languages, that doesn't just arrive magically at the end of training. You need to be investing in curating those data sets, but also in probably generating synthetic loops where you have some types of data to prevent the model from behaving that way when you finally deploy. So it's one thing to measure bias, it's another thing to mitigate. And so you need to be doing both at the same time. So those are some few, but I would say a lot of the advice that I have is people often think of bias as very mythical. There's very practical, down-to-earth things that you can do, which involves articulating what you care about and then having some ways to measure. Also having data collection processes, because most of the way that we mitigate these issues is we augment examples in the training pipeline. So I'll stop there. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this question? I think it's a fun one.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if Mark, you want to weigh in, or Rupa, but or we can segue into the next question and give you guys an opportunity to chat about it. But I mean, from our experience, it's been quite interesting to look at models, and we felt as we were very much embedded into sorry, Mark, but Google Gemini as well as Bedrock both, and we actually have have found through our team that prompt engineering is not as easy as it sounds, and this is one of the biggest challenges that companies would have if they want to really leverage AI. So I'm talking about, you know, not the actual developers of the models, but the eventually the users of the model. So, and you need to actually do some serious work around that and figure out what you want to achieve out of it. As you
Yeah.
said, Sarah, what kind of length do you want in terms of answers, and what do you want to produce as an outcome? Because at the end of the day, if you let it loose, it's going to provide you with a lot of loose answers. And I think you have to kind of always guide it through the prompt engineering process. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's quite interesting. Quite interesting.
The only final thing I'll say there is one recommendation I have. So there's two ways to adapt your model if you're taking a model off the shelf. So one is you can invest in fine tuning. You need a lot of data. It's so often a lot of end users end up using prompting. I would say there to have more consistency, I would suggest experimenting with best event sampling. So you have for the same prompt, you generate multiple completions, and then you have some criteria for selection. You pay for latency because you're generating multiple per turn, but it gives you a lot more control and it boosts quality a lot. So that's one practical recommendation. Yeah.
Good. Mark, did you want to say something?
To that point, Sarah, phenomenal answers. To that point, I was just going to add that I think one of the things that we've thought about at AWS and that I've noticed, at least internally, is that kind of from our Bedrock, and I know Cohere is a partner of the Bedrock product, is that we've noticed, one, the prompt engineering, like to your point, is extraordinarily important, and two, that model choice is also extremely important. And so to kind of chime in on and agree with Sarah, having the capacity to quickly pivot from model to model and see which works best for your specific use case, I think it's great for consumers, it's great for customers. So here.
Good. So Mark, on that note, I mean, in your day to day when you're talking to VCs, sorry, you're talking to startups as a VC. What are the most critical factors that you look into, that you consider when looking to invest into an AI startup? What are the things that you can share with us?
Yeah, once again, I'm not going to speak on behalf of Amazon and or AWS. I'll share my kind of own personal and highly individualized thoughts. And personally, what I'm thinking about when I look at individual kind of AI related startups is, one, there's just a massive breadth of what that means. And so you've got kind of model providers, and I think the family of model providers is starting to, the window to enter into that game may be starting to close relatively soon. I think if you look at the data coming out of kind of Q2 2024, we saw a couple of mega rounds, Cohere being one of them. And so and you know, Mark Zuckerberg made a great point. The next Llama model may cost, you know, an order of magnitude more than the last. And so as costs continue to rise to create more and more intelligent models, that is to say, and also, you know, around data centers specifically, just the overall overhead and CapEx continues to rise. So, like, there's just not going to be that many major players in that space anymore. And so where are folks spending their time? They're spending their time in different types of startups that are kind of impacting the AI tech stack. And so, and even if you continue to go further down the stack, I think we're starting to already see who the leaders are, and in many ways have started to emerge. If you think about Pinecone and there's a handful of players there. And so as I'm thinking about it, and as I'm meeting startups, there's still incredible startups coming out, but they're playing very different roles. Many of them are really focused on the application layer, and how they create a moat will be very different than how Cohere created a moat, in my perspective. And even, you know, if you think about 4 years ago, if you were a PhD that, you know, published a phenomenal paper that, you know, blew up in popularity at New York's, converting that paper into a startup may be more challenging today than it was for 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And so finding those founders that are extraordinarily technical, but also have a vision that's big enough to kind of, you know, meet the market, is something that I'm always interested in. And those founders exist. They're all over the place, and they're sitting in PhD rooms right now, getting ready to go work at Cohere, et cetera. So yeah, that was a relatively high level answer, but that's sort of where I'm spending my time. And I do look for, one, size of the vision, two, experience, three, who have you worked with, and what papers have you published? Yeah.
And you make a fair point in the sense that AI is broad. It's we say AI, but if I ask 10 different people, we'll have 10 different answers of what does AI mean to you. So yeah, here we've talked about large language models, but there's obviously a few more elements of AI, and including the more traditional audio, video AI, and then machine learning and other types of applications of AI. So as a startup, when you're thinking about, you're either developing a new AI in the tech stack of AI, a new AI tool, or you're developing a product or an offering leveraging AI. So kind of, and then depending on where you want to go and what kind of offer you want to put into the market, or which market you're addressing to start with, then you can make those decisions accordingly. Do you develop something new? Do you leverage an existing environment or an existing tool, or an existing tech stack, bedrock, and then
I'll quickly say this. I found that what we're starting to see is folks who are answering similar problems, but are just doing it with different sorts of technical solutions. And so if you think about the kind of, finding an AI software engineer space, there's a ton of phenomenal founders that are in that space, but they're using different methods to kind of solve that problem. And they may have, one may be using an open source model, somebody may, how they're kind of the specific kind of technical features that they're deploying to create a competitive mode, or to create particular outcomes, or to create a smarter kind of software engineer. Those differ from team to team, and so that creates interesting challenges. And you're always going to be kind of, to my point, as I was saying earlier, always going to be looking at kind of what is the cutting edge in terms of the new solutions that are coming out, and which teams are going to be able to constantly kind of iterate around kind of the quickly changing landscape.
Interesting. Yeah, well, Rupa, in terms of, I think, we talked about lots of interesting discussions on tech. But the one important factor is around ethics, and I know you had a particular view on this, and if I can start with just setting up the stage for you in terms of questions. So you have a unique perspective into AI ethics. How do you think startups should think about that? What kind of things should they put in place? Policies, procedures, strategies, considerations that they should put in place to address the ethics element of AI?
Thank you, Ghazi. And that's a very interesting question. And I would love to start this question with a quote by Steve Jobs: deciding what not to do is as important as what to do. So, as AI systems are increasingly integrated within every aspect of our lives and every facet of business operations, and there's a growing spotlight on business leaders to ensure that their organizations deploy AI systems responsibly and ethically. And it goes beyond mere compliance and laws, and it's about doing what's right for society and long term success for their businesses. And business leaders often have their eyes fixed on hard metrics such as profits, earnings, shareholder returns as a primary indicator or of success or failure. And while these metrics are undoubtedly important, it is also crucial to recognize that they're not the sole measures of success. And responsible AI development is not just a matter of ethical considerations, it is also a business imperative. And organizations must balance the pursuit of profitability and shareholder returns with an awareness of the potential risk and ethical implications of their AI systems. So, according to Reddix Web report, AI market is expected to grow by 36.8% from 2023 to 2030 at CAGR, and 97 million people are expected to approximately 97 million people are expected to work in AI by 2025. And the growth of AI innovation is explosive, and it provides several benefits and conveniences to human life. But the important question is, do we really need ethical consideration for AI innovation? And of course we do, because of the dual edge of AI with its benefits and risk. And so how do business approach innovation, balancing innovation with ethics? It first starts with intention and mindset. Companies that do their best recognize that ethics and innovation are twins. They go together, and there's a tendency to put them in separate teams, but they need to be integrated. And overcoming the mindset that AI ethics is an impediment to growth and innovation, and slowing down to build in safety and compliance from the beginning, so that it can help innovation to go faster later. And setting the tone at the top, even if the management doesn't get deeply involved, they need a clear and substantiated policy and directional guidance. And if you do the right things at the top, the bottom line will follow, right? And
It's
yeah.
always Rupa, it's always interesting when you run a business and you're thinking, yeah, of course you're thinking profit, you're thinking, in expenses, investment, you're thinking technology, you're thinking it's always a challenge, as you mentioned, to keep ethics in mind, because of the natural pressure of business. But definitely something, especially in AI, and maybe Sara, you can chime in terms of how do you make sure within your day-to-day work you keep that in mind, and you keep a view of what, especially with large language models that can, again, churn out a lot of content. How do you take that into account,
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry.
Rupa?
Yes, Ghazi. So for the large language models, like what I would say, that to have an awareness and mindfulness about what we are doing, and and
Yeah,
and and also understanding the interconnectedness of the AI systems, and which can have a wider impact uh, on that. And if we are using, for example, large language models, then to be aware about the the results that the outcomes that we are getting, and
yeah,
instead of completely relying on that, but to be mindful about its accuracy, and checking from the relevant sources, the right sources, that whether the information is accurate or not. So I think yes.
yeah. That's what I was trying. I think, Sara, if so, looking at accuracy, looking at output, looking at, I'm sure you've got that within your policies and procedures of quality check and so on. Is that something you can comment on?
So I mean, I can just take a broader view. So the truth is that a lot of risk is not just about the model, it's also about the use case, right? So these are very general purpose models, so they're both more performant and much more risky. So when I mean risky, I mean just they can be steered. So we're at a
Yeah,
point in time where the text for models is indistinguishable from human text. So it brings new problems, right? Rupa, I loved your quote from Steve Jobs. I thought I was like, wow, I have to bring quotes next time. What I think that means is, I thought the quote was saying, there's some places you did decide just not to use something, right? I think that was a quote. I agree with that as well. I think there's some sensitive areas where these models should not be used. Probably the one I bring up the most often is, a human should always be aware that they're talking to a model. That's why I think the use of these models in dating bots is a bit odd. I think sometimes the whole design is meant to make you forget that you're talking to an algorithm. So there's things like that which I think are more risky. So what we do, I think, typically with algorithmic risk is we prioritize the highest risks. That means understanding downstream use cases. So is this being used in an area where there can be harm to humans? Also, I think that we have to understand that guardrails, no matter how good they are, that we bake into our models, once you release models, those can be removed with fine tuning. So people, so there's, what I mean by this is that we have to also be frank where our mitigation techniques fail, honestly. So we can be the most thoughtful and have a lot of mitigation techniques, and we do that, but there has to be more understanding of how those can be undone. And so that is part of, right now, the way that we address this is through, honestly, licenses. So we have licenses where we have allowed use case for open weights models. To be honest, there's not a great framework for enforcement of those licenses. So this is a big open area. Like, we have to understand, as you know, within, you know, what is the traceability of models? And I think this is a big open question. But all this to say is that, you know, I can say a lot of things about what can be done here, but it's important to also understand that whenever you have a technical breakthrough, you have a more powerful tool, which means that there's plenty of really beneficial use cases. There's also amplified risk, and both exist. And so I'm not going to sit here and say we've resolved those. I think in some ways now we're navigating them and adding guardrails where we can. But my main recommendation is typically we need to focus resources on the highest risk use cases, which typically involve human impact. So these are areas which involve, for example, financial decisions, health, also areas where the UI design is made to make you forget that you're talking to an algorithm. And I do think these are much more risky in nature.
Yeah. I had actually an interesting situation a few weeks ago. We had a meeting with a customer, and we had, you know, our engineers and myself and CTO were so happy we developed something really interesting, because we apply large language models into the enterprise or into the industry. So not broad ones, but more specific. So leveraging that capability, but within that environment, plus machine learning algorithms and some AI agent, some new AI agent capability. So we had all this stuff prepared, and we went into the meeting. We were so happy, and then we sat with the customers, showed them, and then the output was some beautiful machine learning model that actually we were going backwards towards the data pipeline and doing integrity checks on the data pipeline using some of the interesting things that I talked about. And then he said to me at the end, he says, "Okay, now what?" And I said, "Oh, what do you mean now what? Well, what do you mean now what?" Because we were focused on the technology. He says, "Yeah, what do I do with this? How do I actually make this part of my, you know, how do I actually integrate this part of my business?" And so, and we kind of looked at each other, all of us, and we said, "Yeah, you need to make sure you're always," because you were kind of referring to this, Sara. You need to make sure, what is the use case, what is the outcome, what are you trying to achieve with this, and then making sure that the tech is there and leverage and be innovative and so on. At the end of the day, how do you actually wrap the tech, specifically AI, into or around a business process so that you can achieve a certain impact in the industry? So that's kind of a nice exercise and an interesting wake-up call with one of the customers we had, which was one we were kind of really embedded in working with. But we actually came out with this with some innovative new offerings and new capabilities. So sometimes these happenings are quite interesting in terms of.
And maybe I'll say one thing there, because I think it's really nice you bring this up, is that, so I work on models, right? I work on the algorithm, but the impact and the actual benefits of this technology only happen when you make a model work within an ecosystem. And I think sometimes, even when we talk about risk being about the model, or we talk about performance being about the model, it kind of misses that point where, and it's why I think, you know, going back to Mark talking about where the value is in the ecosystem, there will be people who build models, and these will be at the edge, and it's developing like the next step. But there's also huge impact in bridging the gap in how these models are used within ecosystems. And most businesses actually have very interesting use cases where marginal improvements can result to large gains, especially if it's a business at scale, old school businesses. But in many ways, you have to, I think what's interesting is that to make that technology work, you have to actually grapple with the ecosystem. What's their tech stack? And also make sure that it works with existing processes, because most people can be excited about a model, but the reality is they won't sustain that excitement unless it works for them in their day-to-day.
Yeah, I know, Mark, maybe as a startup, as an individual who's listening to this and saying, I'm interested to launch my startup and so on. I mean, that would probably be. I mean, what do you think are if you're considering launching a startup, whether you use AI or you develop something new within the AI tech stack? I mean, this is quite important, I think, to look at and understand and focus on what you want to achieve.
Yeah, the safety question is really interesting. I think so. For one, what has confounded me is just the vast delta in terms of opinions on what it means to have a safe AI ecosystem. And so you can listen to kind of like 10 different experts, and some will say like openness equals security. And beyond that, there's also seemingly like very much it's not agreed upon on like what are the actual risks of AI. So if you ask, one researcher, they'll say it's more apocalyptic. If you ask another, they'll say it's actually more localized, and it's about our day-to-day use cases that much more in line with what Sara was highlighting. And you do get, and both of the people giving you those kind of very disparate answers are PhDs. And so, but I suppose on the localized front, one of the things a few of the things that I've been paying attention to, and that I would pay attention to if I were a startup trying to use AI, either in my individual tech stack or entering the space and kind of using maybe an open source model, fine tuning that for a new product I was building. One, I would consider the problem that to me potentially could be a longer term issue, which is that we still haven't really, as I understand it, cracked the question of what's actually happening inside these models. And so I think like in 2022, there was an interesting series of papers from the Anthropic team about mechanistic interpretability. And that was like that seemed to be very promising 2 years ago. I'm not sure what I think, as I understand it, I think they've published more on the topic since then. But when I listen to folks talk about kind of like the black box issue, that seems to be a material concern. There was another paper they published called Predictability and Surprise, kind of related to kind of the larger the model gets, potentially you increase the risk of, even though the intelligence increases as you follow scaling laws, kind of you potentially increase the risk of, one, not understanding how certain models are coming to certain conclusions, and two, once again, potentially following like in correlation with intelligence, you may get answers that kind of catch you off guard and you're not sure how you got there. I think there's been a lot of, this was 2 years ago for both of these examples. There's been a ton of progress on these kind of questions since these papers were written. But that is to say, if I listen to founders from some AI startups today, I still don't think we have a concrete answer as to cracking that black box. And so I suspect, and I know there's also startups that are really working hard, Nan.ai, there's startups that are working hard on kind of trying to fix the hallucination problem. But it seems that it will continue to persist. And even if you see a kind of marginal improvements over time, that will always be a risk. And so obviously, if you look back a year ago, folks were deploying these models into very, very sensitive use cases. And there were not calamitous results, but there were kind of, like there were kind of questionable things happening, and it wasn't 100% positive. And so, in the case of, once again, if you get a co-pilot product, I think that's going to make a ton of sense. And in some cases, even in kind of the medical industry, if you're looking at certain types of paperwork, I think there's going to be a lot of productivity gains there. But if I were a startup, I would just be consistently aware that there's still a lot of issues that, even though we're getting models that are getting more and more and more intelligent and are kind of reaching the upper levels of graduate level reasoning, they're still hallucinating. They're still answering questions incorrectly. And to Sarah's point, I think you can potentially mitigate some of those issues by asking the same questions over and over again, or by improving the way that you're framing the question and kind of reasoning with the models. But I don't know. That's still a major concern of mine from a safety perspective. And so to that point quickly, there's a broader question then around, okay, how do you solve for that? One, I think we can continue to keep models super open, but then there's also like a regulatory question that like has to exist. And I think the onus is going to be on big tech. It's going to be on startups. It's going to be on VCs. It's going to be on the entire AI ecosystem to come together and continue to put out really good policy recommendations. I think there's been a lot of distractions as of late for administrations, so maybe they haven't gotten around to it. I know Kamala Harris has at least spoken about AI, and she kind of released some high level measures. The EU arguably is overeager, but all that being said, it's going to be on all of us to continue to work with folks on what the right solution set is. You don't want to slow down progress, but you do want to have kind of positive outcomes for the end users and keep our customers happy and people safe.
Interesting. We just had a couple of questions. I mean, we'll definitely mix between our discussions and questions from the audience. Well, one which is quite interesting. Maybe Rupa, you wanna like how should startups balance time spent on bias mitigation pre-deployment versus bias correction after deployment? Quite interesting to think about and to address.
Sorry, Ghazi, could you please repeat your question?
Yeah, it's a question from the audience. It's how should startups balance time spent on bias mitigation pre-deployment versus bias correction after deployment? We just talked about that a lot actually, but yeah, it's what do you do? Do you set it out there and then correct, or do you spend a lot of time mitigating the problem pre?
Right. So, starting with this approach that AI ethics and is not considering AI ethics not as an aftermath, but from the very beginning of the problem definition. What problem are we going to, or what problem a business is going to solve, and from that, from the very starting phase, considering the ethical aspect of AI, whether it is bias or privacy or any other challenges of AI. So integrating the ethical challenges, ethical consideration from the very beginning of the project, and integrating these into every life cycle of the AI life cycle, starting from the data, how the whether what are the sources of data, and if data has a certain biases or not, or then coming to algorithm, how the data processing is being done, whether unintentionally biases are introduced while doing the data processing, and also the kind of algorithms that are being used, and also considering the trade-offs. What trade-offs are we keeping in mind while we are creating algorithms? For example, explainability versus performance. Are we focused on performance rather, and we are not considering the explainability of the models? So if we are integrating these challenges, integrating these ethical considerations in every life cycle, then we do not have to allocate a different effort and different resources to mitigate these biases. We can integrate it, and then it is an iterative process. Once we are deploying, once we have also deployed, we can come back and evaluate these AI systems. And I think I hope this
Yeah.
answers. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add, I think it depends. So this idea of whether you do mitigation during the building a model or afterwards, in part depends on the scale. So typically when we think about mitigation, your notion of mitigation changes over time. So that's because bias is very related to power, and your notion of power changes over time, right? So what you're trying to, the same way across the world, like, you know, in the US legal system, we often talk about bias as gender or race. But in other parts of the world, you have very different axes. Like you can have caste, you can have different nationalities, things like that, socioeconomic status. So you want flexibility in how you mitigate, because if you deploy a model in many parts of the world, you want it to be localized to the notions of bias there. Typically, the bigger your training models, the harder it is to intervene at the very beginning. Why? Because each time you're spending a huge amount of compute to train the models, which means that you care a lot more about adaptability and how you steer your models after training. So ideally, right, you do both. But in practice, the sheer cost of intervening can mean that you want more flexibility or to change your model over time. The same way that, for example, over time, preferences change as well. So, for example, if you think about a comedy show that you loved 10 years ago, maybe now it's a bit awkward to rewatch it because things have changed. So that's also, our society changes over time. So that's why we tend to focus a lot on these more flexible methods after training. So both are important, but scale and cost mean that a lot of what's used in practice is these post-training methods.
Interesting. So another interesting question, I think maybe Mark, you can chime on, but the idea of you know, what would be, as a startup, what would be the initial steps that you can take to build on a strong AI-driven foundation, and how can you measure the impact of AI on the growth? So I'm not sure the question is you know, is the right question. It's like, how can you make sure you build a strong AI foundation within a startup? So again, it probably depends on what you want to do as a startup to start with.
Yeah, I'm reticent to speak before Sarah, but I mean, just the level of expertise for this conversation, just we got to get you on a podcast and just listen to you for an hour. And I think I'm biased. I would say like there's really phenomenal solutions coming out of it from the Bedrock platform. I'd say that's a super simple way to get kind of up to speed quickly. And any of the kind of major family of models right now that it currently exists, I think they're all performing extraordinarily well. And so I would say those are all great places to start. And depending on what your technical capability is, you know, call Cohere, ask, you know, get on the phone with their go-to-market team, ask them a question, say, hey, what's the right solution for me? And then after that, say, I won't work with Cohere until I get to talk to Sarah and get exactly that. No, don't do that. But that said, I think that's really the right way to do it. You know, if you're a phenomenal founder, these model providers want to speak to you. They want to work with you. And so they're ready. And then on the second part of the question around how do you measure success, I think the major measurement of success with AI models is usually productivity. And so if you have a particular task and you can measure time to completion on a particular task or an increase in improvement, that to me is the right way to measure it. That can sometimes be a little bit difficult to measure, but there's a lot of studies that show, for instance, you know, in academic settings, you may see a 20% jump in productivity amongst the students, and I can cite these. I'm quoting them from papers I've read in the past, so I can send them over later. But if you see a 20% jump in productivity from a particular subject, or if you see a software engineer that's 10% more productive, or if you see, I know there's another study from Eric Van Holfensen over at Stanford who cites a 14% improvement in productivity amongst customer call centers that use large language models. And so there's a bunch of examples like that. That to me is not the easiest to measure all the time, but to me is what you're looking for, is increases in productivity. So.
Well, efficiency in operation. I mean, we've measured with some of our customers a decrease in operational cost of their environment by 15 to 20%, which is substantial because we're talking about big numbers in terms of costs of running these businesses. So when you
Yeah.
combine, obviously it's not only LLM, but it's a combination of technologies, but you're measuring the impact of your tech onto the customer, and when you do that and you look at what is the effectiveness, and you look at 15 to 20% operational efficiency, improved productivity, you might look at increase in sales. I mean, these are the things that you can do to measure your potential impact on the customer's business, and then eventually the impact on your own business, of course. So yeah, definitely interesting. How has that been, Sara, for you? What's the impact? How has it been for your business?
I love how Mark wants to send me all these founders. No, I think so. I guess there's a few things. So I can talk about, how the impact of how AI should use foundation models, but maybe I'll take a wider view. So I think, Ghazi, you said this. The question is, should you use foundation models at all? I think that's fair, right? So most startups, we think of the prototypical Silicon Valley startup who needs to use foundation models for everything, but many business owners around the world, they probably have old school AI needs. So I think that's also fair. What I would suggest is to choose major use cases within your company, things that take time. So this varies company to company. For example, it could be summarization of meeting notes, or it could be, in many cases, it's extraction of key details from massive reports, things like this. And then to test many different models on it. I thought Mark's suggestion was correct that came up before, because all these models have slightly different specializations. So for example, Cohere models, our bet is on multilingual and on RAG. So we focus a lot on that. So Aya, we released, it's the best in multilingual. We cover the most languages right now at 23 at high performance. But then we have Aya 101. That's a research model that covers 101. So this is pretty extreme. Pretty much, if you can think of a language, that model covers it. So I think in these settings, if you have a multilingual use case, you're going to probably benchmark against our models, and there'll be a few others that you'll consider. But this is what's interesting. So figure out what is your use case that you want to measure progress on, and then you're going to want to sample and compare multiple models to figure out what you want to use. Here's the other thing. I mean, Ghazi, you talked about this as well. It's rarely just a model. It's how it's used. So the other thing that you have to get on board with your whole team is, well, how does the team think it should be measured, the progress? Because otherwise you're constantly going to be codifying a metric, but there's also tracking that metric. And that's why I think it helps to start with a task that pretty much universally is just a huge time drain for productivity. And so summarization or extraction tends to be a very good task that these models are very performant at, but also it's quite easy to track progress on, like how many more summaries are you able to do. And this is really interesting. But the first thing I always say, even though I build these models, is, these models are not mythical. You should decide for yourself, does this fit within your business flow, right? Because most businesses still do spreadsheets and still, may have fairly simple feature models which extract a lot of value. And so the main benefit of these models is that they reduce the cost of communication and information, and in processing of information. So figure out parts of your business that fit those two use cases. Either you speed up communication, or you speed up synthesis of all the data that you already have.
Interesting. And when you think about pitfalls that startups might have, and you just addressed those, you're thinking about sometimes you're so entrenched into what you're doing, you don't necessarily end up doing actually something that is aligned with what the customers would like. So I mean, lots of time spent with the customers and on the output that you deliver, and having these discussions and figuring out, are you getting the benefit that we are hoping that you get from our product, and the customer's view as to how do you think this can be done differently, or what kind of impact can we look at. So you'll be surprised, and the conversations end up giving you so many ideas and improvements into the technology that you do and improvements into the offering that you take to market. And those are some of the pitfalls. I think maybe, Mark, you can also add on the pitfall side that you see, startups, because I know a lot of people are listening to this and thinking, what do I launch? What do I do? What kind of startup do I?
And maybe I'll add just quickly, because I think this way it's worthwhile pointing out. So in terms of pitfalls of what I think startups do when interacting with the technology, I mean, I spoke about one, which is you want AI, but you don't know what you want it for. I think one related one is to rely a lot on, to not have a sense of what your evaluation data set is, to rely on public benchmarks and track models that way, but not have your data set that you want to compare on. So I see this a lot, people defaulting to the leaderboards instead of having their evaluation set ready that they want to compare on. I really encourage that. Maybe the third pitfall I'll say is that you should also realize that you can shape the model. So most people end up spending a lot of time, with prompt engineering, but at a certain scale, you can actually do fine tuning and better adaptation. RAG is a good way of doing this. You can streamline all your documents. So I think that there's tailoring or precisation, sometimes, especially companies which are just starting out. This is an area which is a real differentiator because I think RAG, private deployments, but also, Ghazi, you spoke about this, and I think it's very important, is that sometimes you don't realize what you can do with these models. And so maybe talking to someone like you who's thinking every day about how to integrate these models, I think is very valuable, because sometimes it's very clear. Most people do chat. So chat is the way people are introduced to these models, but actually most commercial use cases are not chat.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. People think of it as a chat model, but actually there's a lot of things that often are very different. Like, for example, just summarizing millions of documents. This is very different as a workload. So yeah, but Mark, go for it. So I just wanted to add, because I thought there was some interesting points there.
No, not at all. I'm 100% aligned. And the only thing I would add is around different solutions. I think if you're a startup, I think there are kind of AI in a box a little bit solutions as well. I think one that comes to mind is like Glean. I know that they're kind of working on this exact issue, which is so I would say, to Sarah's point, really take your time and understand the universe of solutions and where your solution sits in that universe, and then go from there. I think that's a easy to say statement that's potentially a lot harder to actually solve when you're sitting behind the chair as a founder and you're saying, okay, like, what do I actually use here? And so what that means, I think, maybe if you're building a business, don't spend all of your time trying to understand like what is the right solution, but do dedicate some time to it. I think it does have an impact. There is a difference in performance. It's material. There's a difference in output. Their material. It makes a difference in the long term. And so, yeah, I want not much more to say beyond that.
Yeah, and I think, look, we've hit on this point quite often. So the idea is at the end of the day, if you're starting a business, you're trying to do one of two things. You're either in a certain industry where there's a lot of product, and you're actually going into that industry and trying to make it a little more efficient with a new offering, new product, or bringing something totally new and bringing a new product to market. So either you're making something more efficient, or you're bringing a totally new product to a certain market, and there's not much more than that, honestly. So if depending on what you want to do, A or B, then the use of AI and the use of technology or the development of new AI tools would be something that you can think about and look at how you can leverage that to impact your business or impact your decisions on where to go from a startup point of view. Interesting question. Go ahead.
Really quickly, I was also just going to say, I know that there's sometimes folks are sometimes more or less technical. And so if you're less technical, I think, don't be afraid to pick one of the brand names, Cohere, Llama, Mistral, or something along those lines, and just dive in and keep it super simple. And then if you bring on a CTO that has time to actually like dive into it more deeply, I would say do that. But at the end of the day, I think somewhat contradicting some of the previous statements in the conversation and some of them myself. If you're working with a top model, it's still a great model. You'll still get useful responses. I think it's just you're going to get marginal gains the more specific you get. But I would say like at least start, at least dive in immediately and start working with the models. Don't not do it for 6 months because you want to just get started. Yeah.
Yeah, we get and especially when you talk about equality, and there's a question here about the how can you look at data collection to try and effectively customize off-the-shelf models, and how can you get data and get your hands on data, as they say, and what are the best practices to do that and make sure the data is of quality. And this is probably one of the most difficult aspects of the industry that we're talking about, the industry we're in. Are there any best practices? Are there anything that you could suggest to some of these startup hopefuls?
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Ghazi. I would like to add something. In fact, I like this, statement by Mark that do not wait too long or 6 months to start something, and just get your hands dirty. And another suggestion that I would like to say is that do not be too generic, and the specific you get, the terrific you become. So pick a problem that you're trying to solve and narrow down your niche. And so I think that's going to help. And just do a lot more research and be more specific. And yeah.
Yeah. I had an interaction once with a very senior individual at one of the big tech companies talking about data and data quality, which was quite funny to me, because I was saying, let's take a look at what you have, and then whether you're talking about large language models or any kind of data source, honestly, that you can look at. And the response was, we don't have quality data. It's really not good. I don't want to do anything with it. I'm not going to start doing it. But to Mark's point, it's data that is not used becomes less and less of quality. The more you use it, the higher the quality. The more you use it, the higher the quality. The less you use it, the lower the quality of the data. And I think that applies very much so to models. The more you use them, the better they're going to get, and the better the data that they leverage is going to get as well. The better the source of data is going to be leveraged. So I think definitely don't wait, don't hesitate. Yes, you might not get the best answers. Yes, you might not get the best results in the beginning, but the more you do, the better it's going to get. And if you wait, things are not going to be improving. They're going to be actually getting worse in terms for your own environment. So the more you use and the more you actually leverage the data that you have, the better it's going to get.
Briefly, I also think, if you're with a cloud provider, use it. The data's there. The data is with AWS. The data is with Azure. The data is with Google. If you're using Bedrock, it works. The data is right there. If you're using GCP, it works. The data is right there. And additionally, I know there's Dataology, which is a startup that kind of the founders directly out of Europe, and they kind of help with data. Scale AI is another great solution as well. There's like a family of kind of large folks in the space that kind of help with data curation. And so there's a number of different options there. Once again, it may take a little bit of research. I think the easiest way to do it is if you're already, say you're a startup, you just raised $2 million, $3 million, and you're just getting started on a cloud provider. I think it's super simple to just use the API from Bedrock, get the data, you'll have access to it, get started on Cohere, and you're off to the races, as opposed to kind of trying to puzzle everything together into this like puzzle of solutions. I think that can be a little bit laborious, but also it depends on what's right for you as a founder, and different founders have different strategies that work for them. And so
yeah. As we're Just about to wrap up. Any closing thoughts from each of you? Maybe just a quick couple of minutes closing thoughts, starting with maybe back to you, Sara.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation. I'm glad we touched on a few key topics. I think this is really nice. I think practically a lot of this was anchored to your advice for founders and business, which I think is nice because sometimes we end up talking about these models and technology like it's very mythical. And it's a nice way to suggest some concrete recommendations for how people use them for impact. So yeah, really nice conversation. I'll pass to Mark.
Yeah, my only thoughts on the end of the conversation. I think this is one of the few really monumental moments in technology and kind of software that we've seen in the last several decades. It's you want to be on the front line of this. You want to be using the technology right now to build your business. If you're building in the AI space, you want to be leaning in, meeting as many folks in the industry as you can. Send out emails to folks from these major model providers and see what their thoughts are. They are if you have a conversation with somebody from Cohere, that person knows what's coming out in 3 months, 6 months. They can actually tell you a lot of really interesting information. That's true across the industry. So get curious, kind of continue to work hard. I know I think Charlie, the founder of World Salon, is at Columbia right now. And so that would be my thoughts if I was a super young founder, would just be really get your hands dirty, have fun. This is historic. Yeah.
Mark, I thought you were going to give Sara's details right now on the call for people to reach out to her. Rupa, you? How about yourself?
Well, it was an amazing discussion. I got to learn a lot from each one of you, Sara, Mark, and Ghazi, for sure, and much needed discussion. And another suggestion that I would like to give to the participants, that yes, get your hands dirty and do not hesitate to reach out for any suggestion, and be active on LinkedIn. And if something resonates with you, you want to reach out to people, just just message them, try to connect with them, have a conversation, get more ideas and learnings, and yeah, and keep going.
Thank you. But just from my point of view, it's been really, really interesting. Thank you, guys. I've certainly appreciated and learned from it. I mean, from my perspective, if you're looking to do a startup, yeah, I think as an individual, you want to develop yourself in terms of tech, certainly. But one of the key aspects of really becoming a successful startup is also the business aspect of it and the financial aspect of it and the market aspects of it, and really understanding your market and understanding how to run your business. And I think these are questions that you're going to get certainly from venture capitalists and also your customers and so on. So I think just make sure you do a bit of a balancing act. It's always very difficult, but be very, very thorough technically, but also keep an eye out on the business and on the market. So great. Thank you all. Thank you. Really appreciate the time. It's been great. And look forward to speaking next time.